my friend. We are all interested in the future, for that is where you and I are going to spend the rest of our lives. And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future. You are interested in the unknown, the mysterious, the unexplainable. That is why you are here. And now, for the first time, we are bringing to you the full story of what happened on that fateful day.
Soul making, sound shaking, earth quaking, change.
It's September 17th, 2015. This is the Bullshit File. Open source investigating at www.suchbs.com. Today we're going to continue the underreported aspects of the Hillary Clinton email server scandal that's been brewing over the last few months. So this is the email that can land you in jail, part 2. In the last episode, we took a look at the spy network that was swirling around Hillary Clinton while she was the Secretary of State. We took a look at some of the key characters, including the liaison between Clinton and the network, a Mr. Sidney Blumenthal. We took a look at a former ex-CIA chief, Tyler Drumheller, who was part of the network, and also a well-connected mystery man named Cody Shearer. Today we're going to take a closer look at some of the activities of this group, specifically an operation they were putting together in Libya during 2011, and we will examine parallels to other covert operations which were also occurring there at about the same time. Now, some of the material in this episode is by nature a bit speculative, due to how little information is actually available and in the public domain. We're not trying to jump to any conclusions here, but instead simply asking a few questions, as any good investigator ought to, because this particular aspect of the whole email scandal has been hardly covered at all, I would say. And even the few times it was covered in the media, well, it was more like a cover-up. So let's get started right away. Not going to waste any time. Let's take a look at the operation that this network, the Hillary Clinton spy network, was concocting in Libya in May of 2011. The following article we covered last time in episode number 2, part 1, I guess, of this series. The following article was published on the website Gawker.com in conjunction with ProPublica, and it was published on March 27, 2015, and it's titled Leaked Private Emails Reveal Ex-Clinton Aides' Secret Spy Network. The article covers the emails and intelligence memos sent to Hillary Clinton by Mr. Blumenthal from members of the spy network. We're going to skip down and read a few paragraphs about the operation in Libya. The article reads as follows. Blumenthal's email warnings, of course, followed a year of Libyan hawkishness on the part of Clinton. In February of 2011, she told the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva that, quote, "It is time for Gaddafi to go," unquote. The next month, after having described Russian reluctance over military intervention as, quote-unquote, despicable, Clinton met with the rebel leaders in Paris and drummed up support for a no-fly zone while in Cairo. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council voted to back Libyan rebels against Gaddafi. It's this buildup, which Clinton still proudly recalled in her 2014 memoir, that Blumenthal appears to join in on in 2011. In addition to the intel memos, his emails also disclose that he and his associates worked to help the Libyan opposition and even plotted to insert operatives on the ground using a private contractor. A May 14, 2011 email exchange between Blumenthal and Shearer shows that they were negotiating with Drumheller to contract with someone referred to as Grange and the General to place 4 operatives on a week-long mission to Tunis, Tunisia, and, quote, to the border and back, unquote. Tunisia borders upon Libya and Algeria. "Sid, you are doing great work on this," Drumheller wrote to Blumenthal. Quote, "It is going to be around $60,000, covering round-trip business-class airfare to Tunis, travel in the country to the border and back, and other expenses for 7 to 10 days for 4 guys." Unquote. After Blumenthal forwarded that note to Shearer, he wrote back questioning the cost of the operation. Quote, "Sid, do you think the general has to send 4 guys? He told us 3 guys yesterday, a translator and 2 other guys. I understand the difficulty of the mission and realize that K will be repaid, but I am going to need an itemized budget for these guys." Unquote. The General and Grange appear to refer to David L. Grange, a major general in the Army who ran a secret Pentagon Special Operations Unit before retiring in 1999. Grange subsequently founded Osprey Global Solutions, a consulting firm and government contractor that offers logistics, intelligence, security training, armament sales, and other services. The Osprey Foundation, which is a nonprofit arm of Osprey Global Solutions, is listed as one of the State Department's global partners in a 2014 report from the Office of Global Partnerships. Okay, so a few things to take note from this article. We've pulled a lot of information here. Let's break it down. So, first off, we see that Tyler Drumheller, the ex-CIA chief who is part of the spy network, appears to be setting up this operation with General Grange, the retired special ops guy, to send 4 guys to Tunisia and then travel to the border of either Libya or Algeria. It's not quite clear, at least not yet. Also take note of the not so insignificant cost associated with this trip of $60,000. One might wonder where exactly that money is coming from. It also appears that Shearer is the bagman in the whole deal, as he is requesting a line-by-line detailed breakdown of the expenses. And it also seems that Blumenthal seems to be the middleman in this whole operation. It also appears that their contact at the border, someone who they refer to only as K, in other emails from the Guccifer hack, we learn that this is Khalifa al-Sharif, who appears to be giving Cody Shearer daily reports on the situation in Libya, and who seems to have a deep relationship with the Libyan rebels. Now, these rebels and Cody Shearer have quite a bit of contact, at least from what we have, and I'll include the screenshots of these emails. He has a lot of contact with the rebels who form the National Transitional Council, or the NTC, in Libya. In fact, he talks to them so much that he calls them the gang. Now, the Libyan National Transitional Council was formed in late February and early March of 2011, but it would not be officially recognized by the West until later that year. Now, keep all that stuff in mind. There's a lot there. We have the spy network operating in Libya. They seem to be in close contact with the Libyan National Transitional Council, and they're getting this retired special ops guy, David Grange, Major General David Grange, to travel there on this operation. And really, that's about all we know about this operation that was being planned. Like I said, there's not a lot of information out there in the public domain. However, it did receive a treatment in the New York Times. They actually went and quote-unquote investigated, and they produced what I could only call a whitewash of the whole situation. So let's take a look at the official cover up of what was going on here as appeared in the New York Times on May 19th, 2015, under the title, Clinton Friends' Memos on Libya Draw Scrutiny to Politics and Business. We're going to skip down and pull a few paragraphs here to start. Much of the Libya intelligence that Mr. Blumenthal passed on to Mrs. Clinton appears to have come from a group of business associates he was advising as they sought to win contracts from the Libyan transitional government. The venture, which was ultimately unsuccessful, involved other Clinton friends, a private military contractor, and one former CIA spy seeking to get in on the ground floor of the new Libyan economy. The projects, creating floating hospitals to treat Libya's war wounded and temporary housing for displaced people and building schools, would have required State Department permits, but foundered before the business partners could seek official approval. It is not clear whether Mrs. Clinton or the State Department knew of Mr. Blumenthal's interest in pursuing business in Libya. A State Department spokesperson declined to say. Many aspects of Mr. Blumenthal's involvement in the planned Libyan venture remain unclear. He declined repeated requests to discuss it. But interviews with his associates and a review of previously unreported correspondence suggest that, once again, it may be difficult to determine where one of Mr. Blumenthal's jobs ended and another began. Alright, so just real quick here, take note of the fact that the New York Times mentions that the whole deal fell apart before they could even seek official approval to carry out their plans over there in Libya. Just tuck that away in the back of your mind. We'll discuss that a little later on. Skipping down in the article, the Libya venture came together in 2011 when David L. Grange, a retired Army Major General, joined with a newly formed New York firm, Constellations Group, to pursue business leads in Libya. Now, Constellations Group, led by a professional fundraiser and philanthropist named Bill White, was to provide the leads. Mr. Grange's company, Osprey Global Solutions, based in North Carolina, would put, quote, boots on the ground to see if there was an opportunity to do business, unquote, Mr. Grange said in an interview. The men had little experience in Libya. Exactly how Mr. White was to procure leads in Libya is unclear. He spent much of his career as an executive at the Intrepid Sea, Air and Space Museum and had raised money for politicians, businesses, and charities. His biography also describes Mr. White as a consultant for Aquahydrate, a bottled water company whose backers include Ron Burkle, the billionaire investor who has been a close friend of the Clintons. We were thinking, okay, Gaddafi is dead or about to be, and there's opportunities, Mr. White said in a brief telephone interview. He added, we thought, hey, let's try to see who we know there. Now, Mr. White declined to answer follow-up questions about what role Mr. Blumenthal was playing in the business venture. But Mr. Grange described Mr. Blumenthal as an advisor to Mr. White's company, along with two other associates, Tyler Drumheller, a colorful former Central Intelligence Agency official, and Cody Shearer, a longtime Clinton friend. I just know that he was working with the team to work on business development, Mr. Grange said of Mr. Blumenthal. In the spring of 2011, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Drumheller, and Mr. Shearer were helping what was to be Mr. Grange's first trip to Libya, according to emails stolen by a Romanian hacker and published by Gawker and ProPublica in March. Okay, so just bear in mind a few things to keep track of here. First, the fact that the New York Times actually confirms that Grange and his crew went into Libya for this operation and not Algeria, as the Gawker article failed to specify. So yes, we have confirmation from, I guess, the man himself that he actually did go into Libya. Also note that Grange fingers Blumenthal as actually being a whole consultant on the operation and not just the middleman he appears from the emails. Now let's take one more paragraph here to wrap up the cover story. Skipping down further in the article, it reads as follows. In August, Mr. Grange signed a memorandum of understanding with 2 senior officials in the Libyan transitional government to provide, quote, humanitarian assistance, medical services, and disaster mitigation, unquote, along with helping to train a new national police force. The agreement fell apart, Mr. Grange said, but the partners continued to seek other projects in Libya, including a proposal to create the floating hospitals to treat the country's war wounded. But doing business there proved difficult. Some Libyan leaders were wary about working with Western companies, while the contractors could not figure out whom to make deals with. Quote, it was just so fractionalized over there, Mr. Grange said. You never knew who to believe or trust or who was in charge of what, unquote. Alright, finally now, take note of the fact that Mr. Grange signed a memorandum of understanding with the rebels in August of 2011. Also, keep in mind the fact that the New York Times describes the operations of this whole group as humanitarian assistance and medical services, building schools, etc., etc. And also remember that despite having signed this memorandum of understanding with the what would actually become to be the recognized leaders of the country after Gaddafi's fall, somehow, even though he secured this agreement, the entire business, quote-unquote, fell apart because, well, you know, they just couldn't figure out who to make the deals with. Anyways, we're going to touch on all of those aspects of the New York Times cover story a little later on. But before we get to that, let's get the opinion of the actual person who broke the original story. Veteran journalist Jeff Girth seems to have a very different take from the New York Times in their investigation of the whole thing. The following article appeared on Breitbart.com, and it was published March 30th, 2015 under the title Journalist Who Unveiled Hillary Spy Network Draws Iran-Contra Parallel. And the article reads as follows. In what Breitbart Executive Chairman Stephen K. Bannon referred to as a stunning and breathtaking course of events, Jeff Girth of ProPublica came on Breitbart News Sunday to discuss his recent article detailing how an ex-Hillary Clinton aide crafted a secret spying network in the lead-up to the Benghazi terror attack and corresponded with Clinton via her private email account. Bannon asked Girth, quote, have you ever in your investigations and your stretch as a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner investigative journalist for the paper of record in this country, have you ever seen anything in your professional career like this? Girth answered by reminding Bannon that he had been doing this for 40 years and that there were 2 instances in which this reminds him. He said that the Hillary email spy network episode draws some parallels with the stuff that came out of Iran-Contra with Richard Secord and other people who were out operating in Nicaragua with the Contras. He added that it reminded him also of a story that he investigated on CIA operative and business tycoon Edwin Wilson, who went to prison for selling arms to Libya back in the late 1970s. Okay, well, those are some very interesting comparisons to make. Now, the Iran-Contra case may be familiar to some people. The Ed Wilson case probably isn't. Let's just throw in a few background details so you kind of understand what we're talking about with the Iran-Contra case and the Ed Wilson affair. Now, the following clip actually comes from a cartoon called American Dad, but it's kind of a neat little quick wrap-up of what was going on with the Iran-Contra case. It's kind of funny. I'd recommend you watch the video because it adds a lot to it. But anyways, let's take a listen to this for the background on the Iran-Contra affair.
In the 80s there was Cold War drama. We fought the commies inside Nicaragua. Our friends were the Contras. Freedom was their mantra, so we sent them lots of money for guns and landmines. But Congress stopped the Contra money flow just cause they moved a teeny bit of blow. But then a hero came forth, his name was Oliver North. He and Reagan went around the sissy Congress. Ollie North, Ollie North. You see, North secretly sold missiles to a harmless country called Iran and would always be a grateful ally. Then he gave the profits to the Contras. Genius! But the sales were uncovered by the press. Reagan and North began to stress. Cause what they did was technically high treason. But it was totally justified. North volunteered to take the blame to save Reagan from prison rape shame. The truth he did bury with his hot secretary, thanks to her shredder. He got off totally scot-free. Ollie North, Ollie North. He's a soldier and a hero and a novelist, and now he's on Fox News.
Okay, alright, so that's Iran-Contra. Now, here is just a little smidget just to get you interested in the Ed Wilson affair.
This man, Kevin Mulcahy, formerly of the CIA, turned state's evidence in a case that is still reverberating throughout Washington. In June 1976, Mulcahy became a partner in Intercontinental Technology, a company with headquarters here at 1612 K Street, Washington. The other two partners in ITI were Frank Turple and a man called Ed Wilson, who impressed Mulcahy with his contacts in official Washington.
Socially, Ed and I met a number of retired individuals from the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as people that were currently employed by the Central Intelligence Agency. We, on more than 3 occasions, we had visited Capitol Hill and met the legislative and administrative assistants to a number of congressmen and senators.
Wilson had served in the CIA and Naval Intelligence. He also owned a 1,500-acre estate in Virginia and was close to men like Strom Thurmond, the ultra-right-wing Republican senator, and Theodore Shackley, then deputy director of the CIA. The question is, why did a man with these connections form a company with Frank Turple to join the Russians, the East Germans, and the Bulgarians as suppliers to one of the most radical leaders in the Arab world? And how were Wilson and Turple contracted to export tons of explosives, hundreds of classified night vision devices, and 500,000 detonators out of the United States for delivery to America's supposed arch enemy, Muammar Gaddafi?
Ah, yes, there's a lot to say there, and in the future I do want to do a whole episode on Wilson and all his compatriots there. But for what we're looking at today, what do Iran-Contra and Ed Wilson have in common? A weapons trafficking, yes, and that's what we are going to look at next. Alright, so now that we've looked at the Clinton spy network operation, and we've checked out the details of the New York Times whitewash, let's look at some of the eerie parallels between this operation and one that we for sure know was taking place in Libya at around the same time. And that would be the U.S. covert arming of the Libyan rebels to overthrow the Gaddafi regime. But first, as always, let me give you the backgrounder on the whole scenario of exactly what was taking place in what has now been called the First Libyan Civil War, from the most mainstream of all mainstream sources, Wikipedia. Okay, so Wikipedia, under the heading of the First Civil War in the Libyan Civil War, it's kind of confusing. Anyways, here's how Wikipedia sums it up. In early 2011, a civil war broke out in the context of the wider Arab Spring. The anti-Gaddafi forces formed a committee named the National Transitional Council on February 27, 2011. It was meant to act as an interim authority in the rebel-controlled areas. After a number of atrocities were committed by the government, with the threat of further bloodshed, a multinational coalition led by NATO forces intervened on March 21, 2011, with the aim to protect civilians against attacks by the government's forces. Now, at the same time, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant against Gaddafi and his entourage on June 27, 2011. Gaddafi was ousted from power in the wake of the fall of Tripoli to the rebel forces on August 20, 2011, although pockets of resistance held by forces loyal to Gaddafi's government held out for another 2 months, especially in Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, which he declared the new capital of Libya on September 1, 2011. The fall of the last remaining cities under pro-Gaddafi control and Sirte's capture on October 20, 2011, followed by the subsequent killing of Gaddafi, marked the end of the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. I don't know what that means, but anyways, we'll say marks the end of the first civil war in this ongoing Libyan crisis. Alright, so that's a nice little clean wrap-up. Essentially, you got protests started in Libya in early 2011 during the whole Arab Spring uprisings. The rebels formed a council in February of the same year. In March, the U.S. and NATO intervene. Gaddafi is ousted when the capital falls in August, and by October, he's captured and killed. And all that in just under a year. Not too shabby. Now, during all this madness that was going on in the country, there were a few times, and specifically just prior to the NATO intervention, when the rebels were actually on the ropes and it looked like Gaddafi was going to crush the uprising. Now, since the U.S. didn't want to send in troops during this whole conflict, we of course did the next best thing, which was to bomb the crap out of the whole country, and also to arm the rebel fighters in a covert operation. So here's what you need to know about that. Now, at the end of February 2011, President Obama signed a secret order authorizing the arming of the Libyan rebels, which was reported by Reuters on March 3rd, 2011. Now, in this article, Reuters reported that President Barack Obama has signed a secret order authorizing covert U.S. government support for rebel forces seeking to oust Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, government officials told Reuters on Wednesday. Obama signed the order, known as a presidential finding, within the last 2 or 3 weeks, according to government sources familiar with the matter. Such findings are a principal form of presidential directive used to authorize secret operations by the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. This is a necessary legal step before such action can take place, but does not mean that it will. Skipping down. People familiar with U.S. intelligence procedures said that the presidential covert action findings are normally crafted to provide broad authorization for a range of potential U.S. government actions to support a particular covert objective. In order for specific operations to be carried out under the provisions of such a broad authorization, For example, the delivery of cash or weapons to anti-Gaddafi forces, the White House would also have to give additional permission allowing such activities to proceed. Now, because U.S. and allied intelligence agencies still have many questions about the identities and the leadership of anti-Gaddafi forces, any covert U.S. activities are likely to proceed cautiously until more information about the rebels can be collected and analyzed, officials said. Alright, so a couple things to take note of from that article. Again, remember, March 3rd, beginning of March, we know that just a few weeks prior, the president had signed this essentially finding which gave basic access for the U.S. government to arm these rebels. Now, note how the article said that additional permission was supposedly required to start the arms shipments. Also take note of the fact that the flow of weapons would depend on getting details on who exactly the rebels were. This is important because a little later on we are going to look at exactly who set up the first meeting between Hillary Clinton and the National Transitional Council, the rebels in Libya, in Paris shortly before the U.S. and NATO got involved in Libya. So keep all that in mind. Now, we had confirmation of the actual weapon shipments a little later on. It was confirmed in a New York Times article from December 5th, 2012. In this article, it was titled, U.S. Approved Arms for Libya Rebels Fell into Jihadi Hands, which sounds disconcerting. Skipping down, we're going to get a quick glimpse at the details of the actual covert operation. The article reads as follows. Although NATO provided air support that proved critical for the Libyan rebels, the Obama administration wanted to avoid getting immersed in a ground war which officials feared could lead the United States into another quagmire in the Middle East. As a result, the White House largely relied on Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, two small Persian Gulf states and frequent allies of the United States. Qatar, a tiny nation whose natural gas reserves had made it enormously wealthy for years, has tried to expand its influence in the Arab world. Since 2011, with dictatorships in the Middle East and North Africa coming under siege, Qatar has given arms and money to various opposition and militant groups, chiefly Sunni Islamists, in hopes of cementing alliances with the new governments. Officials from Qatar and the UAE would not comment. After discussions among members of the National Security Council, the Obama administration backed the arms shipments from both countries, according to two former administration officials briefed on the talks. American officials say that the UAE first approached the Obama administration during the early months of the Libyan uprising, asking for permission to ship American-built weapons that the United States had supplied for the Emiratis' use. The administration rejected that request, but instead urged the Emiratis to ship weapons to Libya that could not be traced to the United States. The UAE was asking for clearance to send U.S. weapons, said one former official. We told them it's okay to ship other weapons. For its part, Qatar supplied weapons made outside the United States, including French and Russian-designed arms, according to people familiar with the shipments. But the American support for the arms shipments from Qatar and the Emiratis could not be completely hidden. NATO air and sea forces around Libya had to be alerted not to interdict the cargo planes and freighters transporting the arms into Libya from Qatar and the Emiratis, American officials said. Okay, so a lot of very pertinent information in there. First of all, take note that the weapons were sent into Libya through the proxy countries, our good allies, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. These are countries which we will be taking a closer look at a little later on in the program. Also, I think it's very interesting here to note that you really get the first glimpse of some of the outside players who actually knew that this operation was going on, and namely that it must have fallen under NATO because they had to have been advised, as the article reports, not to interdict the cargo planes and shipping containers that were coming across jam-packed with weapons into this country. Finally, one more little piece here. I'm going to play you a short clip from ABC News, which comes out of Australia. And this clip is from a man named Musa Ibrahim, who was a Libyan government spokesman, giving some details of one of these actual shipments of weapons that were headed to the rebels, which were captured by the Libyan government in July of 2011. So here's a clip of an actual Libyan spokesman with weapons seized in this operation that they said at the time in July of 2011, hey, this stuff is going to these guys. What's going on here? Take a listen.
When we captured the two boats and questioned the Libyan rebels, they admitted that they had communications with NATO and that NATO arranged the submission of these weapons to them, and that the whole operation was provided by the Qatari army with the coordination of NATO ships in the Mediterranean.
Alright, so there you go. I'll also throw in a link to a longer video that shows the massive arms cache, so you can see the guns and everything with your own eyes. But I think that should be enough outline here on the real U.S. covert operation that was being run in 2011 by America and NATO and probably other Western allies and our partners in the Gulf area, Qatar and the UAE. The actual operation that was supplying weapons to the Libyan rebels to overthrow Gaddafi. So now I think we've got a pretty good outline, a pretty good background. We've seen the operation that the Clinton spy network was running. We've seen the whitewash of that operation that the New York Times did. We've looked at the details of that. And now we've seen the actual U.S. operation that was going on, that was really happening to arm these rebels. So let's get now to the meat and potatoes of the whole thing. And we'll start by taking a look at the crisscrossing paths of the real U.S. covert operation that happened to supply these weapons to the rebels in Libya, and the efforts of the Clinton spy network's operation in Libya, which, again, was taking place at the exact same time. So first off, let's take a look at one of, I think, probably the most provocative aspects or pieces of evidence in this whole case. And that is an email which was forwarded from Hillary Clinton on April 8th, 2011 to one of her aides in the State Department, Jacob Sullivan. Now, this email contained, it was forwarded from Clinton, but the original email came from Sidney Blumenthal, and it contained one of his patented confidential information memos that he was so often sending to Hillary. So let's take a quick look at this email. Alright, now Blumenthal's actual intelligence report deals with sources inside the rebel movement in Libya and how they're worried that Great Britain is perhaps playing both sides of the game. And probably the most important piece comes at the bottom when the memo notes, in the opinion of these individuals, the Libyan National Council, the LNC military leaders, are considering the possibility of hiring private security firms to help train and organize their forces. One of these individuals added that a number of the LNC members believe that this solution may be the best for the rebels, noting that if they accept clandestine aid from France and or Great Britain, those two countries will be in a position to control the development of post-Gaddafi Libya. Now, that's probably doesn't mean much, but what makes it so interesting is the fact the one sentence that Hillary Clinton included when she forwarded this intelligence memo along to her aides in the State Department, she included this: FYI, the idea of using private security experts to arm the opposition should be considered. And that's a direct quote from Hillary Clinton, according to her email. So I will link this up to you. So, a couple things on this. Number one, she thinks that arming the rebels with private security experts should be considered. That's huge in light of what we know subsequently took place. Also, you gotta remember that this is in April of 2011, just a few short months after Obama signed that secret order greenlighting future covert support for the Libyan rebels. So basically what you see here is that Blumenthal's reports from the spy network are very subtly suggesting that the Libyan rebels may be seeking out these private security firms to organize and train themselves. And Hillary's response was essentially, hey, that's a great idea, let's consider doing this. And of course we know, again, that that is exactly what happened. As we read in the New York Times article from December of 2012, where weapons made outside the U.S. were shipped through Qatar and to Libya. But more connections abound. Now here's an email from Blumenthal to Hillary Clinton from March of 2011. Now this is a intelligence memo which was sent by Sidney Blumenthal to Hillary Clinton. It's dated March 6, 2011, and Blumenthal, right off the bat, notes that Cody, and he's speaking of Cody Shearer, again, another member of the spy network, he says Cody, on his own, still at heart an indefatigable journalist, simply picked up the phone, dialing the number given to him by Redacted, and had a conversation with one of the key figures in the Libyan National Council that seeks to become an interim government. Cody's notes, including Mr. Jibril's numbers, are below. Cody says that Jibril said he has not been contacted by anyone from the U.S. government. And then the note follows. Cody Shearer writes, so I spoke to Dr. Mohammed Jibril today. He was the former Minister of Planning but is now the point man between the reformist government in waiting and the West. I spoke to him in Cairo. He will fly tomorrow morning to Rome and then on to Strasbourg, France, where he plans to address the European Parliament on Wednesday morning. Mohammed Jibril seems very smart, level-headed, and has no desire to serve in a future government. He only wants to help in the transition. We talked for about 20 minutes and he emphasized how important it is that any help from the West not be perceived as interference by the heroic young people who are losing their lives in fighting the madman. He thinks it is going to be a protracted battle, but the West must recognize the temporary opposition government ASAP. Skipping down, he says, someone should contact Mahmoud Jibril. Alright, so why is this particular email so interesting? Well, because just about a week after that was sent, Hillary actually met with Mahmoud Jibril in Paris, in secret, on March 14th, 2011. And as to the implications of this meeting, well, let's briefly look at an article that was published by the Washington Times on January 28th, 2015, under the title of Secret Tapes Undermine Hillary Clinton on Libya War. We're going to skip down. We're not too worried about the secret tapes right now. Let's take just 3 quick paragraphs here from the article. Mrs. Clinton met with Libyan rebel spokesman Mahmoud Jibril in the Paris Westin Hotel in mid-March so she could vet the rebel cause to unseat Gaddafi. 45 minutes after speaking with Mr. Jibril, Mrs. Clinton was convinced that a military intervention was needed. Quote, I talked extensively about the dreams of a democratic civil state where all Libyans are equal, a political participatory system with no exclusions of any Libyans, even the followers of Gaddafi who did not commit crimes against the Libyan people, and how the international community should protect civilians from a possible genocide like the one that took place in Rwanda. Unquote, Mr. Jibril told the Times. I felt by the end of the meeting I had passed the test and Benghazi was saved. So on March 17, 2011, the U.S. supported UN Security Council Resolution 1973 for military intervention in Libya to help protect its people from Gaddafi's forthcoming march on Benghazi, where he threatened that he would show no mercy to the resistors. Alright, now, I know I'm moving kind of fast here and we're hitting a lot of names and dates, but I want to break this down because this chain of events is so crucial to the thesis that I'm trying to lay out here. Now, first of all, we see the Clinton spy network, for all intents and purposes, essentially setting up the very first meeting between the Libyan rebels and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. We know from Sidney Blumenthal's memo that he forwarded to Hillary Clinton on March 6, 2011, that another member of the spy network, Cody Shearer, contacted the newly formed Libyan Transitional National Council, and the man he contacted, his point man, was Mahmoud Jibril. And then we see Blumenthal forward along Jibril's numbers to Hillary Clinton. Then, just about a week later, we see Hillary meet with Jibril in Paris, where she essentially decided right then and there that military intervention in Libya was the way to go. Not only that, also remember that the rebels would need to be vetted before the spigot could be turned on to the flow of arms to them. We read that in the article relating to Obama's secret order that he signed at the end of February 2011. So this meeting really served a dual purpose. Remember, as Jibril put it, he quote-unquote passed the test when he interviewed with Hillary. Then, right on the heels of this meeting, just a few days later, the United Nations passes UN Resolution 1973, which essentially lets the West intervene and pretty much clears the way for the arms transfers to go ahead. Then, just a few weeks later, in April of 2011, we again see the Clinton spy network essentially baiting the hook for Hillary to arm the rebels with Blumenthal's, another one of his patented intelligence memos coming from either Drumheller or Cody Shearer about using private security firms to train and arm the rebels, which pretty much Clinton takes the bait and says, oh yeah, we should definitely consider this. Then, the very next month, in May of 2011, we see the spy network putting together a team including retired military commander of U.S. Central Command, David Grange, to go into Libya to, well, how did he put it? See if there was an opportunity to do business. But what kind of business were they doing? Well, the New York Times cover story claimed it was all humanitarian aid and, medical work, building schools, floating hospitals, yada, yada, yada. Remember? But, and now here's where the cover story starts to kind of fall apart, if you take a look at that memorandum of understanding that I mentioned way back at the beginning of this episode, the one that General Grange and signed with the rebels after this whole operation where they sent him into Libya, that wasn't really all they agreed to. And we know this because in the Guccifer hack, this actually leaked out. So let me just read a couple little gems here from the Memorandum of Understanding that was actually signed. In the first phase of this contract, over the first 6 months, they're going to coordinate humanitarian assistance and medical services, provide medevac services, ship-to-shore logistical support, expeditionary housing construction, establishing emergency care and mobile clinics, all the stuff we've already talked about. However, there is a phase 2 to this memorandum, and it's described as to be implemented on order of the NTC, the National Transitional Council. And this includes stuff like training of the Republic of Libya military and police forces, including rule of law and rule of land warfare, unit training on every level from squad to division, weaponry training, logistics training, maintenance, equipment maintenance, and also intelligence and security training. And so if you ask me, that sure sounds like a heck of a lot more than just the medical and building schools that the New York Times wrote it off to be. I mean, they're practically going to set up the whole entire police and military forces in the country of Libya, train them to do everything from the ground up, including fighting, intelligence, maybe covert operations, who knows. Also, when you look at General Grange's Memorandum of Understanding that was signed, it was actually signed by two very interesting people. Now, one of them is named Mohammed Kikia, who is supposedly a man named Mansour Mohammed el-Kikia, who was a representative of the National Transitional Council for the city of Benghazi, the same city which would later play host to the infamous U.S. Special Mission Compound, which was attacked in 2012, and also to the lesser-known but very closely related CIA Annex. The other man who is mentioned in the Memorandum of Understanding is a Dr. Aref Ali Nayed, who was the Libyan ambassador in the new government and I believe he still is actually, but he was the Libyan ambassador to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which of course is a country where we know that weapons and money for weapons were flowing from into Libya. Dr. Nayed was appointed ambassador in August of 2011, the same month that this Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Now also you need to take into account and remember the fact that, as the New York Times portrayed it in the cover story, how the whole deal fell apart because these knuckleheads couldn't figure out who they needed to deal with. Even though they somehow knew the number for one of the head guys in the NTC right after it was created, and they hooked him up with Hillary Clinton. Even though they somehow knew a guy in the NTC who paid 60 grand for Grange to get his foot in the door in Libya. And even though they had tons of sources inside Libya passing along intimate details of the day-to-day operations of the rebels, which were then passed along to Hillary in Blumenthal's memos. Yep, that's right. You're expected, and we're expected to believe that somehow these guys just couldn't pull it together. Also, remember how the New York Times said that this whole deal fell apart before they were even able to seek any approval from U.S. officials? Well, actually, there's a document from the Guccifer archives which seems to contradict that notion. In this letter to Assistant Secretary of State Andrew J. Shapiro, a very important name, remember that, this letter was written on Osprey Global Solutions letterhead. Again, this is our guy, this is Grange. On his letterhead, he writes a letter to the Assistant Secretary of State, Andrew J. Shapiro. It's dated January 4th, 2012. And in the letter, Grange describes how his company is keen to support the people of Libya under the sponsorship of the Ministry of Finance and the Libyan Stock Exchange, specifically in the person of Naguib Obeda, who has agreed to secure our visas and host our travel to Tripoli and Benghazi in the next 2 weeks. He then notes specifically, we are prepared to provide the following services, which includes stuff like providing ship-to-shore, maritime medical and logistical support, advanced field hospital services, and mobile command and control. This would include the immediate deployment of a hospital ship, very interesting, equipped with rotary wing assets. We'll also supply medical services to include medevac and QRF, both fixed-wing and rotary aircraft. Establishment of a network of emergency care and mobile clinics on shore, and logistics and infrastructure support as prescribed and prioritized by the TNC. So yeah, I mean, he was writing a letter to the top guy. Well, so who is this top guy? Who is Andrew J. Shapiro? Well, he's actually the top guy at the State Department's Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. And one look at his obviously PR firm crafted biography on Wikipedia should tell you all you need to know about this guy. In the very first sentence of his biography, it reads, from 2009 to 2013, Mr. Shapiro served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, where he revitalized and deepened political military partnerships at home and abroad, and promoted record-setting foreign military sales, creating thousands of jobs in the United States while contributing to the security of key U.S. partners. Blah, blah, blah. Anyways, all you need to take out of there is that this guy promoted record-setting foreign military sales. I wonder if that includes guns. That certainly would be an unusual coincidence, right? But wait, there's more. Here's Andrew J. Shapiro giving a speech at the Stimson Center in February of 2012.
Today, I want to talk to you about our efforts to address the threat posed by shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile systems, also known as man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS. Currently in Libya, we are engaged in the most extensive effort to combat the proliferation of MANPADS in U.S. history.
Rocket launchers in Libya, you say? Now this could be quite interesting. Let's listen on.
We were concerned about Libya's stockpiles of MANPADS well before the outbreak of fighting last spring. In fact, during the brief earlier effort to reestablish relations with Libya, MANPADS was a topic that we sought to address with the Gaddafi regime. As the Arab Spring spread and as protests gathered momentum in Libya, our MANPADS task force was well aware of the scope of the challenge. With our team's experience working in other conflict countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, we also knew what to expect, and we were ready to respond. When the fighting escalated and the Gaddafi regime was pushed back from Benghazi, we took immediate steps to try to mitigate the proliferation dangers. In April of last year, we began providing $3 million of funding to NGOs to get them on the ground. These NGOs specialize in conventional weapons destruction and stockpile security and have significant experience. They immediately began working with the Transitional National Council, or TNC, to clear unexploded ordnance and remnants of war, and assisted the TNC in securing loose weapons, including MANPADS.
Wait, did you catch that? He said in April of 2011, the State Department began providing $3 million in funding to get NGOs, non-governmental organizations, on the ground in Libya? NGOs who specifically specialized in stockpile security? Who exactly were these NGOs? Well, this just gets curiouser and curiouser, I would say. It is also another interesting coincidence that the spy network was going to be doing a lot of humanitarian and medical assistance in Libya, including operating large hospital ships and coordinating logistics between shore and sea, in light of the fact that secret weapons caches would later be found in humanitarian aid shipments originating from the country of Libya.
This mysterious Libyan ship and who has its dangerous cargo may be linked to the 9/11 terrorist attacks at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. Using these ship records, Fox News has confirmed Al-Antasar, which means the victory, was received in the Turkish port of Iskenderiye on September 6th. This is just 5 days before Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Management Officer Sean Smith, and former Navy SEALs Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty were killed during an extended terrorist assault by 125 members of Islamist militias. According to that initial September 14th report by the Times of London, 400 tons of cargo was on board, some humanitarian, but also the largest consignment of weapons headed for Syria's rebels on the front lines.
This is a Libyan ship by the name of Al-Intisar, Victory, which is carrying basically weapons that are found in Libya.
Waleed Faris is a Middle East and terrorism expert for Fox News.
Now, from the information that is available, there were aid material, but there were also weapons. A lot of weapons.
The cargo reportedly included surface-to-air anti-aircraft missiles like these. SAM-7, RPGs. Russian-designed manned portable air defense systems known as MANPADS. The ship's Libyan captain told the Times of London that, quote, "I can only talk about the medicine and humanitarian aid for the Syrian rebels."
But finally, since we're getting close to the end here, just to wrap this whole thing up, perhaps the most begging piece of evidence in this whole entire episode, these operations and how they crisscross across each other, is the case of Mr. Mark Turry. Now, Turry is a U.S.-based international arms dealer who tried to sell arms to Libya around 2011 by moving the guns through countries like Qatar and the UAE, creating what he called a zero-footprint supply chain. Now, you should be saying to yourself, well, that sounds familiar. Well, in May of 2011, he received approval from the State Department to sell his guns to Qatar. But then in July, his home was raided by the federal authorities, and he is now facing several charges. He also thinks that his zero-footprint idea was ripped off by people in the State Department, and he is now fighting them in a court battle where the government is trying to invoke the state secrets privilege in his case. So just to close this out, let's go ahead and listen to a little summation on the case, the strange case, of Mark Turi.
American arms dealer Mark Turi is at the center of a federal investigation involving Libya, Syria, and Turkey. Turi is president of the Turi Defense Group, a company that for decades has been licensed and regulated by the State Department to sell and move tons of weapons around the world.
If a certain country is brokering various types of equipment, we try to get involved. Primarily weapons and ammunition, transportation, logistics, government liaison.
Turi says he is haunted by what he thinks happened when there was a failure to oversee who got the weapons pouring into Syria, Libya, and elsewhere in the Middle East during the Arab Spring. Officially, those who receive or use weapons following U.S. policy are referred to as end users. In 2011, Turi pursued Libya as a business opportunity, as dictator Muammar Gaddafi's regime was falling apart. Turi shared emails from 2011. The traffic indicates that high-level Democratic, Republican intelligence and military contacts, both inside and outside of government, encouraged him to explore options for arming the Libyan opposition.
Yes, I kept getting information from my associates that are liaising with members of Congress and saying, there's still interest, keep going.
Turi's initial application to sell weapons directly to the Libyan opposition, known as the TNC, was denied.
It made perfect and very clear sense, because the TNC was not a recognized entity in the world, which means they could never have signed an end-user statement. That's where I came up with this zero-footprint Arab supply chain, whereby our foreign ally supplies another Arab country.
Turi says it was a workaround because at the time the U.S. had not officially recognized the rebels under the TNC.
My idea was to set up a warehouse where the only person that could take that equipment out, or the only entity that could take that equipment out of Qatar or UAE, was the U.S. government.
As part of the workaround, the U.S. would supply conventional weapons to another U.S. ally, Qatar.
There's a 60-millimeter mortar with optics, 120-millimeter mortar, all conventional type weapons. If you want to limit the exposure to the U.S. government, what you simply do is outsource it to your allies. The partners, the Qataris and the Emiratis, did exactly what they were contracted to do.
During Hillary Clinton's term as Secretary of State, U.S. arms dealers were awarded a record number of export licenses to sell sophisticated weapons, military parts, and technology internationally. Selena Realu is a professor of national security at the Perry Center at the National Defense University.
If you would like to engage in arms sales and you're a U.S. manufacturer, you actually seek license and apply for an export license with the State Department. Andrew Shapiro served as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs under Secretary Clinton. That role is actually responsible for overseeing this entire export control process at the State Department.
March 2011 was a busy time for Hillary Clinton and her team, which included Andrew Shapiro and senior advisor Huma Abedin. On the 14th, along with Chris Stevens, then serving as the embassy's deputy chief of mission in Libya, Clinton met with Mustafa Jibril, a senior member of the TNC. The next day, Clinton met with Egypt's transitional leader, Nabil el-Arabi, in Cairo, and walked through Tahrir Square with Abedin. At the same time, government documents showed that Turi's proposal, a $267 million contract, was working its way through official channels.
My application was submitted on the 12th. These brokers then, through their relationship with the TNC, then provided that application information to Ms. Clinton via the TNC Council. when she was in Cairo. That's what was told to me.
Turi also showed Fox emails from April 6th and 7th, 2011, that he exchanged with Chris Stevens' personal email account, alerting him to his application to sell weapons. Stevens replied with a thank you, and I'll keep it in mind and share it with my colleagues in Washington.
He is the point guy now.
The following month, Turi received this preliminary approval letter from the State Department for his $267 million arms proposal for Qatar. In July, his Arizona home was raided by federal agents.
They came in with full body armor and weapons, and they take my computers and my cell phones, and they've been chasing me all over the world for the past 3 years, speaking to associates of mine all over the United States and looking into my records and my past.
Now Turi is facing trial set for this September on 2 counts that he allegedly violated the Arms Export Control Act by making false statements. His attorney Jean-Jacques Cabot told Fox in emails that his client had a track record working for the U.S. government through the Central Intelligence Agency, and his client neither lied on any application nor did he do anything other than support U.S. foreign policy and interests in the Middle East. Turi insists he never shipped any weapons to Qatar, and others stole the zero footprint idea.
Why isn't the State Department contacting me about making a mistake on my application? The State Department had a lead on this. They were going to run it with their people. And who that is, I have no idea. They were going to run it with their people. And who that is, I have no idea. And who that is, I have no idea. And who that is, I have no idea.
Who indeed, Mr. Turi? Who indeed? As always, you can join in the information gathering and open source investigations at www.suchbs.com.